Gremlins was a formative movie for me. It was one of those VHS tapes that would get worn out from being watched so many times as a kid, and watching it would eventually become an annual and 100% mandatory December tradition. And despite there being only 2 films in the franchise, those gremlins seemed to keep getting water spilled on them and multiplying off into all sorts of merchandising, apparel, an animated series, cursed theme park attractions, and of course video games of volatile quality. So today we'll be diving into every Gremlins video game ever over the last 40 years, from the great to the Gizmo Caca. So just to catch up anyone who hasn't seen the original film, Joe Dante's Gremlins from 1984 is a harrowing tale of Mogwai falling from the sky, trying to eat Billy Peltzer's meticulously arranged collection of burgers, which are the key catalysts for them turning into gremlins, and then Billy must shoot them with a gun. Okay, so that's what the Atari 2600 game would have you believe anyway. It at least makes for a passable premise for a simple 2-screen action game, alternating between the kaboom-like Mogwai catching and Space Invaders-like gremlin shooting. The more you play, the faster everything gets, so there's at least a nice amount of challenge as you push yourself to higher scores. While the variety between the 2 screens is nice, there isn't really much here that hasn't already been done before. That same year would see another Gremlins game get made for the Atari 5200, along with ports for the Apple II, Commodore, and IBM PC. The Atari release ended up being delayed by a couple of years due to turmoil within the company, supposedly making Gremlins to be the final officially released Atari 5200 game in 1986. This time around, we have more of a Robotron vibe going on, as you control a sword-wielding Billy progressing through countless nights of hacking up gremlins and rounding up Mogwai into a box before they manage to find anything to eat and transform. There are also puddles of water scattered about, causing either creature to multiply upon contact, a camera flash item that will freeze everything on screen for a few seconds, and other various objects like TVs that seem to distract gremlins and Mogwai alike. At first, this one feels a bit more fun than its 2600 counterpart, and certainly an improvement in the graphics department with an impressive amount of things on the screen and better animation. But at a certain point, I found that the game's level of challenge hits a very low ceiling, and without much effort, you'll just keep earning extra lives from points, and the levels will just recycle themselves. The game is endless as well, and restarts after night 99, so at some point you'll probably just get tired of it. The Gremlins would continue to pop up on home computers in 1985 with Gremlins The Adventure, a text parser adventure game released on the ZX Spectrum, BBC Micro, Acorn Electron, and Commodore computers. Some versions including actual graphics, like the Commodore 64 version shown here. So you'll move, get, climb, push, look, kill, and weld your way through that fateful night from the film, with the game kicking off with you in Billy's room full of gremlin pods and a gremlin ready to throw a dart into your skull if you make one wrong move. Or maybe even if you make the right move anyway, he might just kill you regardless. This game actually starts out pretty cool once you puzzle your way through a sequence of decapitating the gremlin next to your Christmas tree and figuring out how to operate that legendary microwave and blender. But you'll find out pretty soon that extreme levels of patience and brute force are required for the amount of trial and error ahead. I eventually caved and used a walkthrough to get more footage for this video. And man, there are a lot of things to figure out, and some of the puzzle solutions are bewilderingly cryptic and elaborate. All while gangs of gremlins will periodically show up after a certain amount of time, and you'll continuously need to deal with them as they start to follow you around. And while this adventure doesn't follow the movie's events exactly, if you haven't seen the film yet, it will be exponentially more difficult. And if you don't have the means to save your progress to a cassette tape, you might as well give in to the gremlin hordes. This one is for the hardcore fans only. Props to any geniuses out there who beat this one without a guide. And one last game to mention before moving on to the new batch is one we sadly never got to play, an Atari-made Gremlins arcade game planned for release in 1985, but canceled for reasons unknown. Video footage of the prototype was released by AtariGames.com, but as of now, there has never been a playable dump of the ROM released. The footage shows off 3 different sections of gameplay, putting you in control of Billy's mom in the infamous kitchen scene, Billy himself zapping gremlins with a flashlight, and Gizmo driving through the department store to finally reach Stripe at the fountain. It's nice to see a good attempt at recapturing various memorable moments of the film, including the movie's wonderful soundtrack, and it's a shame there isn't a playable version floating around out there yet. While the Gremlins film sequel, released in 1990, did not quite attain the level of box office success of the original, it again was the center of a substantial merchandising push and unleashed a whole new batch of games on various platforms. And maybe I'm showing my cards too early here, but it's probably not a surprise that the NES version you're seeing is definitely the best of the bunch. Developed and published by Sunsoft, in Gremlins 2, the new batch, you'll be controlling Gizmo fresh off of his escape from the lab within a gremlin-infested Clamp Center. Gameplay takes the form of a top-down action platformer, reminiscent of sections from previous Sunsoft classics Blaster Master and Fester's Quest, but with less emphasis on exploration and more focus on tricky platforming and hectic combat. It is worth going off the beaten path sometimes though, as you might find Mr. Wing's shop and be able to buy a helpful power-up like more health, a weapon upgrade, or a balloon of shame that will let you skip through an area after you fall into a pit. As you progress through stages, you'll also get permanent weapon upgrades to help you in your battle against the wide variety of gremlin hybrids and other miscellaneous foes. And unlike Sunsoft's Batman video game, Gremlins 2 actually does seem to make a good effort to include a lot of references to the source material, with the game's enemies, items, locations, and fans of the off-kilter film sequel will often be pointing at the screen with glee. Wonderful pixel art and a stellar soundtrack round things out into a highly polished experience, something you often didn't get with movie-licensed NES games back in the day. And getting back to the gameplay, it's fun, generally smooth to control, and rather difficult, but still reasonable thanks to unlimited continues and a password system. It certainly makes for a fun afternoon playthrough, and it's one I tend to come back to pretty often. Sunsoft would also release a Gremlins 2 for gamers on the go with a completely different experience on the Game Boy. You still control Gizmo here, but in a more traditional side-scrolling platformer framework, and still generally following the events of the movie and including many of the eclectic cast of experimental gremlins to battle with. Typically armed with a frustratingly tiny pencil, you'll soon find an alarming amount of platforming precision is required to make progress in this one. And while continues are still unlimited here, I found this one to be quite a bit more challenging than its NES counterpart. Overall though, I'd still say this one is definitely worth playing, and it's another good example of a very solidly made movie licensed game. It also has some great art and chipper music, and some especially nice looking cutscenes. Just be warned, some of the later levels and boss fights get really mean, but you're rewarded with a satisfying gremlin melting ending if you can power through it. The Gremlins would also infect all sorts of home computers with a new batch game released on Commodore 64, Amiga, Atari ST, MSX, ZX Spectrum, Amstrad CPC, and DOS, the version I tried out here. Now, this was a Spanish-developed game made by TopoSoft and distributed abroad by Elite. This time around, you'll play as Billy in his own adventure through Clamp Center, armed with a laser gun-like flashlight, or the occasional boomerang telephone, tomato, or frisbee. It's a screen-by-screen, one-hit kill action platformer with a hectic amount of constantly spawning gremlins in your path. You'll need to track down one specific item in each of the 5 stages in order to move on to the next. And you'll have 7 lives and no continues to avoid a gremlin takeover of New York. Despite the pretty extreme level of difficulty, I actually really enjoyed what I played with this one. Admittedly, I could only get to level 3 so far, but each screen is generally pretty consistent and can be figured out with enough memorization and trial and error. To mix things up a bit though, there's also a dreaded jetpack gremlin that likes to show up after you've been alive for too long, and he can really throw a wrench into your plans sometimes. Regardless, this is one I might keep trying at. I really like the pixel art and the game feel, and I'm a bit of a masochist sometimes when it comes to difficult games. I will say this DOS version is a bit lacking in the music and sound department, and the Amiga version might be the way to go if you want a better soundtrack. Oddly enough, we would get another Gremlins 2 game for DOS, released 1 year later by High Tech Expressions, a name that may cause a shudder amongst intrepid explorers of jank. You play as Billy again, but in more of a top-down exploration kind of game that has you wandering over 40 similar-looking floors of Clamp Center in very haphazardly laid-out rooms, eradicating various office supply-throwing gremlins, and eating ice cream and hot dogs off of the floor. I had some trouble getting into this one. You'll often run out of juice for your flashlight, and the building's level of infestation just constantly increases, and you can probably guess how tedious managing that will get. You can get Gizmo to follow you around a bit, and apparently there's a camera power-up somewhere if I had the patience to play this one for more than 20 minutes. Maybe I'm missing something here, but this one felt like a fresh pile of Gizmo Caca. Now flash forward 10 years to 2001, and despite the Gremlins not really being relevant in Hollywood any longer, we would receive Gremlins Unleashed on the Game Boy Color, developed by LSP and released exclusively in Europe, and loosely based on the first Gremlins film. It's essentially a slide-scrolling collectathon platformer, but you at least get the choice between playing as Gizmo or Stripe, with the levels generally being the same, but with a different moveset and different hazards and items to grab depending on who you picked. There are 10 stages total, each being completed by collecting the required number of glasses or bottles. Why we need these is a very good question left unanswered. I could not source an instruction manual for this game. And why to play this game might be another very good question. Despite the graphics looking pretty decent, if not a bit uneven, the gameplay is very generic, and collecting stuff gets pretty tedious rather quickly. A few mini-games will mix things up between stages, but they basically amount to either button-mashing contests or the dreaded slide puzzle, which gives you a game over if you fail, by the way. But, pro tip, you will still get a working password for the next level, and can skip the puzzle if these happen to melt your brain like they do to mine. One other somewhat entertaining thing you get is unlocking these bizarre gremlin drawings. So if a gremlin handy is worth it to you, maybe check this out. But there's not much else to get excited about here. The following year, LSP would build on their Gremlin game formula with Gremlins Stripe vs. Gizmo on the Game Boy Advance. Again with another collectathon letting you pick between Gizmo or Stripe, but with a more festive twist this time around as you collect a certain number of Christmas presents required to exit the stage. They each have different movesets again, with Gizmo getting a rolly attack move and a double jump, and Stripe with a basic claw swipe. But at least you get different enemies to deal with depending on your character choice. Each character will also be able to grab items to dispatch stunned enemies, a flashlight in Gizmo's case, and cream pies for Stripe in order to convert Mogwais into gremlin buddies. I will mention, Gizmo's playthrough is interspersed with a few extra boss fights, something missing from Stripe's playthrough for some reason. I guess they didn't feel like making new encounters with various Mogwai, and instead you just get one final showdown with Gizmo. This game has considerably fewer stages than Gremlins Unleashed, so the tedium doesn't last as long, and you can tear through both playthroughs pretty quickly if you want to. The gameplay at least feels a bit more fast and fluid here. Luckily, there are more presents in the levels than what you need to exit, so you won't have to be backtracking and scouring the stages quite as much. One major flaw in this game, however, is the nauseating camera, as it will constantly whip back and forth every time you press left or right. You can kinda get used to it after a while, and it's probably not as noticeable if you're playing on a handheld instead of a larger screen, but it's a big issue if you have any inclination towards motion sickness. Overall, this one's kinda disappointing, as it seems like it had some potential, especially with some really nice pixel art and animation here, and more responsive controls than Unleashed, but at its core, it's still focused on tedious item collecting and really lacks any substance. And in one more Gremlins game that never saw the light of day, we have Gremlins Revenge, originally planned for a release in 2003 for the GameCube and PS2, once again from LSP. Apparently, it was going to be a squad-based shooter of some kind, even featuring multiplayer modes, so definitely a much different approach than their handheld titles. Unfortunately, there isn't much info on this other than a few screenshots and a video of one of the cutscenes, and no playable versions to be found.
The package arrived for you today. I have no idea what it is, though.
Gizmo would finally come out of hibernation again with the release of Gremlins Gizmo on the Nintendo Wii and DS in 2011, published by collectible toy maker NECA. So this is more of a basic virtual Mogwai simulator and minigame compilation, where Gizmo and a handful of his little friends can take part in various activities around the house, like ring toss, trampoline, driving, singing, dancing, balloon shooting, stargazing, coloring, vacuuming, and extreme gaming. The more stuff you do will allow you to unlock more parts of the house, which sometimes will need a brief moment of gremlin shushing. You'll also gradually unlock harder difficulties for some of the games, and more Mogwai friends, and more costumes. If there's anything good to come out of this bewildering experience, it is definitely Frog Suit Gizmo. Tamagotchi fans shouldn't get too excited about the Wii version here. Other than being able to poke your Mogwai a little bit, you don't really seem to manage their mood or hunger or anything like that. The DS version does have a little bit of pet care and some different stylus utilizing minigames as well, so at least there are some slight differences between the two versions, but they share the same core concept. So while this firmly sits in the minigame shovelware camp, I've honestly played much worse, and maybe some younger kids might have fun with this one. Unfortunately, my copy of the game installed some gremlins in my Wii, as I was just on the cusp of unlocking the final room when the game crashed on me. Well, at least I got in a few games of Desert Dash first. And while this is not exactly a Gremlins game on its own, I do have to mention the Toys to Life game LEGO Dimensions did have a Gremlins set produced, and featured a pretty substantial Gremlins-themed world to explore, complete with scenarios within Kingston Falls and Clamp Center. The minifigures included Gizmo, Stripe, Gizmo's car, and a Polaroid camera, and in typical LEGO game fashion, there are a nice handful of little quests to complete and golden LEGO blocks to collect. I appreciated the many nods and references to both movies, and while there isn't a ton of content here, it's safe to say this is the best Gremlins gaming we would get since the Sunsoft games. And special thanks go to Arcadia Collectibles for letting me play with their Legos and acquire this footage.
Looks like you're not going anywhere.
Another Gizmo Stripe video game appearance is in the Warner Brothers take on Smash Bros. Multiversus, which was an open beta for a while, but currently scheduled for a full release sometime in 2024. Gizmo and Stripe were both playable characters with different movesets, and I'm guessing they will show up again in the final version. I didn't get a chance to try this out while the beta version was playable, but maybe I'll have to check it out once it's finished.
In the end, to every freedom known to Gorgonites.
One last honorable mention here are a couple of games based on Small Soldiers, another Joe Dante film from 1998, which really felt to me like a spiritual sequel to Gremlins in many ways. So this movie also got games on the Game Boy and the PS1, and even an LCD handheld. I didn't play these ones in depth yet, but the PS1 game seems like a pretty solid 3D run and gun thing, and the Game Boy game lets you run and jump. So yeah, maybe it's fine. And maybe we'll dig into these another time. And that wraps up all of the Gremlins video games to date here. It will be interesting to see if there are more on the way, as there is certainly some nostalgia still out there for Gizmo and the gang. And who knows, maybe someday we'll finally get that rumored Gremlins 3 movie if somebody ever screws up their Mogwai feeding schedule once again. Let me know your favorite Gremlins game in the comments, and thanks so much for watching.